General, what's your reaction to what we heard so far from the president and the defense secretary?
I'm hard to put together my thoughts on this, Anna, to be honest with you. First of all, I think we ought to address the atmospherics. We're talking about a huge American flag behind the speakers. That's reminiscent of the opening scene from the movie Patton, which President Trump has said he absolutely loves. I don't think that flag is normally there at the Quantico, museum, but we'll see. In terms of what Secretary Hegseth has said, those were anticipated, as well as what the president is doing. It's anticipated. These are the kinds of speeches the president has given at Fort Bragg in front of a roaring group of soldiers who all said they were supporters of his. At West Point, I was there when he gave the graduation address. This is somewhat similar to the speech he gave at the UN. It's somewhat shocking, and it's filled with mistruths. And he's addressing a bunch of men and women who serve all over the world, who have firsthand experience in some of the alliances and what he's talking about in terms of warfighting. So I would suspect it's not being taken well.
Okay. So Donald Trump just walked into what might be the most uncomfortable room of his entire presidency, September 30th, 2025, Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia. Trump summoned hundreds of generals and admirals from across the United States and around the globe for what was supposed to be this big moment, a display of military support, a chance to rally the troops, so to speak, around his national security agenda. Trump probably imagined standing ovations, enthusiastic support, military leaders hanging on his every word. But that's not what happened, not even close. Instead, Trump walked into a room of complete silence, ice-cold reception, generals and admirals sitting there stone-faced while Trump talked for 73 minutes. No applause, no enthusiasm, just uncomfortable, deafening silence. And according to reports from inside that room, multiple senior military leaders were prepared to walk out or resign if Trump crossed certain lines. This wasn't support. This was barely contained mutiny. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
When I first started listening to the speech, I found my mouth open. I just couldn't believe some of the things that were being said to this group of individuals who have such experience. And one last thing I'd say, Anna, the thing I've got to stick up for is the defense of the American military. The soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines I've never served with Space Force Guardians, but those four services I've had the opportunity to serve with, not only in combat, but on the joint staff and in various assignments through my career. There are no finer human beings across our force.
Trump apparently noticed the silence immediately. According to the New York Times, he joked about it during his speech. He said, "Never walked into a room so quiet." Then he added, "You're allowed to leave if you don't like what you hear." Think about that for a second. The President of the United States is standing in front of hundreds of top military commanders, and he has to acknowledge how awkward and hostile the atmosphere is. He has to give them permission to leave because the tension is so thick. That's not normal. That's not what presidential addresses to military leadership look like. Usually there's at least polite applause, some show of respect for the office, even if there's private disagreement with the person. But Trump got nothing, just silence, just hundreds of military leaders sitting there refusing to give him even the basic courtesy of a response. And behind the scenes, it was even worse. According to the Atlantic's reporting, several senior officers privately admitted they were prepared to resign if Trump demanded personal loyalty pledges, if he tried to make them swear allegiance to him rather than to the Constitution, if he pushed them to carry out orders they viewed as illegal or unconstitutional. These weren't junior officers. These were top commanders, people with decades of experience, people who've served under multiple presidents from both parties, and they were ready to walk away from their careers rather than comply with what Trump might demand. The word used to describe the mood was mutinous. That's not hyperbole. That's reporting from defense journalists who cover the Pentagon for a living. The military leadership was on the verge of open rebellion against the commander-in-chief. This summit happened in the context of Trump firing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, of him deploying National Guard troops into American cities over the objections of local officials, of him treating the military as a personal force rather than an institution that serves the Constitution. Military leaders have been watching all of this. They've been increasingly alarmed, and this summit was apparently the breaking point, where senior commanders decided that if Trump pushed any further, they would refuse, they would resign, they would walk out. They would make it clear that there are limits to what they'll do, even under orders from the president. That's extraordinary. That's a constitutional crisis in slow motion, because civilian control of the military is a foundational principle of American democracy. But that principle assumes the civilian leader respects constitutional limits. When the president doesn't, when he treats the military as a tool for political purposes, military leaders face an impossible choice: obey orders and violate their oath to the Constitution, or refuse orders and create a crisis of authority. Just days before this summit, Marine Corps Colonel Douglas Krugman publicly resigned after 24 years of service. He didn't just quietly retire. He made a statement. He said Trump shows disregard for the oath of office and treats the Constitution like a suggestion. A Marine Corps colonel with 24 years of service doesn't say that lightly. That's someone who's reached a point where staying in uniform feels like betraying everything he swore to defend. And Krugman apparently isn't alone. Multiple other officers at various ranks have been considering resignation. Some have already left. Others are waiting to see if things improve or if Trump crosses more red lines. The military is hemorrhaging experienced leaders who can't reconcile serving Trump with serving the Constitution. That's a crisis. That's the kind of thing that fundamentally weakens national security, because you need experienced, principled leaders in the military. When those people leave, you're left with either yes men who'll do whatever Trump wants, or inexperienced officers who aren't ready for the responsibilities they're being given. Trump's 73-minute address apparently covered his national security priorities, his views on various global threats, his expectations for military readiness and deployment, but the content almost doesn't matter because of how it was received. When your audience sits in complete silence for 73 minutes, when senior military leaders are prepared to resign rather than follow your orders, the specific words you say are almost irrelevant. The message being sent is much clearer than anything Trump said. The message is, we don't trust you, we don't support you, we're only here because we have to be, and if you push us too far, we're going to leave. That's what Trump walked into. That's the rude awakening he got. He thought he could summon military leadership and they'd fall in line. He thought he could flex presidential authority and commanders would snap to attention. Instead, he got silence, resistance, and the very real possibility that his top military leaders will walk out on him. And here's the thing that makes this even more significant. The military has traditionally been one of the most respected institutions in America. They stay out of politics. They serve whoever's elected. They maintain that apolitical stance even when they disagree with presidential decisions. So when military leaders reach the point where they're openly uncomfortable with the president, where they're signaling potential resignation, where the mood in the room is described as mutinous, that tells you something profound about how far Trump has pushed, about how much he's violated norms and expectations, about how dangerous his approach to presidential power has become. This isn't Democrats criticizing Trump. This isn't the media being unfair. This is the military, the institution Trump claims to love and support, showing him they've had enough. Okay, let's dig into what's been happening at the Pentagon and why this summit turned out this way. So, here's the context that led to this incredibly tense summit at Marine Corps University. Trump has been pushing the boundaries of how presidents use military power domestically since he took office for his second term. He's deployed National Guard troops into American cities despite opposition from mayors and governors. He's talked about using active duty military for domestic law enforcement, which is generally prohibited by the Posse Comitatus Act. He's fired senior military leaders who've pushed back on his plans, and he's made it increasingly clear that he views the military as a tool for his political agenda rather than an institution that serves the Constitution. All of this has created enormous tension at the Pentagon. Military leaders have been trying to figure out how to navigate this situation, how to maintain their oath to the Constitution while also following orders from their commander-in-chief. And that tension reached a critical point with this Virginia summit. The firing of the Joint Chiefs chairman was a major escalation. The chairman is the highest-ranking military officer in the country, the principal military advisor to the president, and Trump fired him, apparently because he wasn't sufficiently loyal or because he pushed back on some of Trump's plans. The exact reasons aren't entirely clear publicly, but the message was clear: fall in line or you're gone. That sent shockwaves through the military leadership, because if even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs isn't safe, then nobody is. Every general and admiral suddenly had to calculate whether speaking up or pushing back on questionable orders was worth the risk of being fired. And for some of them, the answer was that they'd rather resign than compromise their principles, that they'd rather walk away from decades of service than be complicit in what they see as unconstitutional actions. The National Guard deployments have been particularly controversial. Trump has sent Guard troops into cities to deal with protests or civil unrest, often over the objections of local officials. Mayors and governors have said they don't want federal troops in their cities, that they have their own law enforcement and don't need military intervention. But Trump has overridden those objections using various legal justifications, and that's put guard commanders in an impossible position. They're getting orders from the president to deploy, but they're also hearing from state and local officials that they're not wanted or needed. They're caught between federal authority and state sovereignty, between following orders and respecting local control. And when those orders involve deploying military force against American civilians, even in a peacekeeping capacity, it raises profound constitutional questions. Military leaders take their oath to the Constitution seriously. They swear to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They don't swear loyalty to the president. That distinction matters. It means that when presidents give orders that seem to violate the Constitution, military officers face a dilemma. Do they follow orders because of the chain of command, or do they refuse because following those orders would violate their oath? Throughout American history, that's mostly been a theoretical question. Presidents have generally stayed within constitutional bounds, or at least close enough that military leaders didn't feel they needed to refuse orders. But Trump has pushed further than previous presidents. He's tested those boundaries in ways that make military leaders genuinely worry about being ordered to do things that are illegal or unconstitutional. And that's created this atmosphere where resignation seems like a real option, where walking away from a career is preferable to following orders you believe are wrong. The Atlantic's reporting about officers being prepared to resign if Trump demanded personal loyalty pledges is particularly significant, because loyalty oaths to individual leaders rather than to the Constitution are a hallmark of authoritarian regimes. They're how dictators ensure military support. They're how democratic norms get eroded. American military officers swear an oath to the Constitution, not to the president, precisely to prevent that kind of personalization of loyalty. So if Trump was considering demanding personal loyalty pledges, that would be a massive red flag, a clear signal that he's trying to transform the military from an institution that serves the country into a tool that serves him personally. And military leaders apparently decided that if he went that far, they would refuse. They would resign rather than swear personal loyalty to Trump. That's a powerful statement about where the line is, about what they're willing to tolerate and what they're not. The silence during Trump's 73-minute address speaks volumes. That's not normal. When presidents address military audiences, there's usually applause at certain points, enthusiastic responses to patriotic rhetoric, some show of support and engagement. But Trump got nothing. For 73 minutes, he talked to a room of hundreds of senior military leaders, and they sat in silence. That's a form of protest. It's a way of saying, we're here because we have to be, but we're not giving you our support or enthusiasm. We're not going to pretend we're on board with your agenda. Trump clearly noticed and felt uncomfortable with it, which is why he made that joke about never walking into a room so quiet and telling them they could leave. He was trying to break the tension, trying to get some kind of reaction, but he didn't get it. The military leadership maintained their silent protest throughout his entire speech. Behind the scenes, there were apparently discussions among senior officers about whether to stage a walkout, about whether leaving en masse during Trump's speech would send the right message. Ultimately, that didn't happen. No one walked out during the actual address, but the fact that it was even being discussed tells you how close things were to a complete breakdown. Military leaders were seriously considering the most public form of protest possible, walking out while the president is speaking. That would have been an unprecedented moment in American history. A visible, undeniable rejection of presidential authority by the military leadership. It didn't happen, probably because cooler heads prevailed and people decided that maintaining at least the appearance of institutional stability was important. But it was apparently a real possibility, and the willingness to even consider it shows how dire things have gotten. Colonel Krugman's public resignation, just days before the summit, set the stage for this confrontation. Krugman didn't just quietly retire. He made a public statement, specifically calling out Trump's disregard for the Constitution. He said Trump treats the Constitution like a suggestion rather than the supreme law of the land. That's a Marine Corps colonel with 24 years of service, publicly accusing the president of violating his oath of office. That's extraordinary. And Krugman's resignation apparently resonated with other officers who've been feeling the same way. He gave voice to concerns that many military leaders share but haven't been willing to express publicly. And his decision to resign rather than continue serving under Trump gave permission, in a sense, for others to consider the same path. If a respected colonel with decades of service can walk away on principle, then it's not dishonorable or cowardly for others to do the same. The broader pattern here is Trump trying to politicize and personalize the military. He wants generals and admirals who are loyal to him rather than to the institution or the Constitution. He wants commanders who will carry out his orders without question or pushback. He wants the military to be a tool for his political agenda, whether that's deploying troops domestically to deal with protests or using military imagery and rhetoric to boost his political standing or whatever else he has in mind. But the military leadership has resisted that transformation. They've maintained that their loyalty is to the Constitution and to the country, not to Trump personally. And that's created this fundamental clash between Trump's expectations and military norms. Trump thinks he should get unquestioning obedience because he's the commander-in-chief. Military leaders think they have an obligation to push back when orders seem unconstitutional or illegal, and neither side is willing to back down. This Virginia summit was supposed to be Trump's moment to assert authority, to remind military leaders that he's in charge, to rally support for his national security agenda, but it backfired spectacularly. Instead of showing Trump's strength, it exposed his weakness. It showed that military leaders don't support him, that they're uncomfortable with his leadership, that they're prepared to resign rather than follow his orders. That's not the image of presidential authority that Trump wanted to project. That's the image of a president losing control of a critical institution. And that image is now out there. Defense reporters covered it. The Atlantic and New York Times ran detailed stories about the tension and near mutiny. The story is that Trump can't command the respect or support of his own military leadership. That's politically devastating, and it's probably accurate. The question now is what happens next? Does Trump escalate? Does he start firing more generals and admirals who won't show sufficient loyalty? Does he try to purge the military leadership and replace them with more compliant officers? Or does he back off, recognizing that pushing the military too hard could create an institutional crisis he can't control? Neither option is great for Trump. Escalating risks open rebellion and mass resignations that would cripple military readiness and create a national security crisis. Backing off makes him look weak and undermines his authority with other parts of the government. So Trump is stuck. He created this confrontation by pushing the military too hard, and now he's facing consequences he probably didn't anticipate. Military leaders who are prepared to walk away rather than follow his orders. An atmosphere of distrust and resistance at the highest levels of the Pentagon, and public reporting about all of it that damages his image and political standing. Okay, so what does all of this actually mean? Let's break it down. Here's the bottom line. The silent protests and near mutiny at Trump's Virginia summit represents a critical breakdown in the relationship between the president and military leadership. This has enormous implications for national security, constitutional order, and Trump's political future. Let's break down what's really at stake. First, the fundamental question of civilian control of the military versus constitutional limits on presidential power. American democracy depends on civilian control of the military. The president, as an elected civilian, is the commander-in-chief. Military officers follow orders from the president. That's how the system is supposed to work. But that system also depends on presidents respecting constitutional limits, or not using the military for purposes that violate the law or fundamental democratic principles. Trump has been testing those limits. He's deployed military forces domestically in ways that are controversial and possibly illegal. He's fired military leaders who push back. He's demanded loyalty in ways that seem to prioritize personal allegiance over constitutional duty. And military leaders are now pushing back. They're saying there are limits to what they'll do even under presidential orders, that their oath to the Constitution supersedes their obligation to obey the commander-in-chief. That's a profound claim because it means military leaders are asserting the right to judge whether presidential orders are legal and constitutional, to refuse orders they believe cross the line. That's not how civilian control of the military is supposed to work in theory, but in practice, when a president abuses his authority and demands actions that violate the Constitution, military leaders may have no choice but to assert that authority. The alternative is blind obedience to unconstitutional orders, which itself would violate their oath. So we're in this impossible situation where both sides can claim they're defending constitutional principles. Trump says military leaders owe him obedience as commander-in-chief. Military leaders say they owe allegiance to the Constitution, not to Trump personally. And there's no easy way to resolve that conflict. Second, what this means for military readiness and national security. When you have senior military leaders prepared to resign en masse, when the relationship between the president and the Pentagon is this toxic, that creates real national security risks. Because you need experienced, competent leadership in the military. You need trust and communication between the president and his military advisors. You need a functional chain of command. And right now, none of that exists. Trump has created an atmosphere where military leaders don't trust him, where they're preparing to resign rather than follow his orders, where the mood is described as mutinous. That's not a recipe for effective national defense. If there's a genuine crisis, if the country faces a real threat, will Trump's military leadership respond effectively? Will they trust his judgment? Will they carry out orders they might otherwise question because of the emergency? Or will the dysfunction and distrust continue even in a crisis? Those are terrifying questions. And the fact that we have to ask them shows how badly Trump has damaged civil-military relations. The brain drain from the military is also a serious problem. Colonel Krugman's resignation is just one example. Other experienced officers are leaving or considering leaving, and the ones who stay might be the ones who are most willing to compromise their principles, most willing to follow questionable orders, most willing to prioritize loyalty to Trump over loyalty to the Constitution. That's selection bias in the worst possible way. You're driving out the principled leaders and retaining the compliant ones. That weakens the military institutionally. It reduces the quality of leadership, and it makes future abuses of power more likely because there are fewer people in positions of authority willing to push back. Third, the political implications. This Virginia summit is a disaster for Trump's image. The reporting about silence, near mutiny, and officers prepared to resign makes Trump look weak. It makes him look like he's lost control of a critical institution. His opponents are going to use this against him relentlessly. They're going to say even his own military leaders don't support him. Even generals and admirals prepared to resign rather than follow his orders. If the people who know him best and work closest with him on national security don't trust him, why should voters? That's a powerful argument, and it's based on factual reporting from reputable sources. Trump can't easily dismiss it as fake news when the Atlantic and New York Times are reporting based on sources inside the military. When defense journalists who cover the Pentagon are confirming the accounts, when a Marine Corps colonel publicly resigns and cites Trump's disregard for the Constitution, all of that creates a narrative that Trump is dangerous, that he doesn't respect democratic norms, that even the institutions that are supposed to support him are in rebellion against his leadership. For Republicans, this creates a difficult situation. Do they defend Trump's approach to military leadership? Do they side with the generals and admirals who are pushing back? Most Republicans will probably try to avoid the issue entirely. They'll say it's an internal Pentagon matter. They'll change the subject to other topics. But that avoidance is itself revealing. If they really believe Trump was in the right, they'd defend him loudly. The fact that they're staying quiet suggests they know this is indefensible, that Trump has gone too far, but they're too afraid of his base to say so publicly. So they're caught in this uncomfortable middle ground where they can't defend Trump but won't criticize him either, and that makes them look weak and complicit. Fourth, the constitutional crisis this represents. We're in uncharted territory when military leaders are openly signaling resistance to the president, when they're prepared to resign en masse if certain lines are crossed, when the mood at the highest levels of the military is described as mutinous. That's a constitutional crisis. Maybe not in the immediate dramatic sense of tanks in the streets, but in the deeper sense of fundamental institutions and relationships breaking down. The military is supposed to be apolitical. They're supposed to follow civilian leadership. But when that civilian leadership demands unconstitutional actions, when the president treats the military as a personal tool rather than an institution serving the country, the military faces an impossible choice. And we're watching that choice play out in real time. Some officers are resigning, others are staying, but prepared to disobey certain orders. Still others are maintaining silent protests. But all of them are navigating territory that American military leaders have rarely had to deal with, and there's no clear playbook for how this ends well. Fifth, what happens next? Trump now faces a choice. He can escalate, firing more generals and admirals until he finds people who will do exactly what he wants without question. But that path leads to a hollowed-out military leadership filled with yes-men. It leads to more resignations among principled officers. It leads to reduced readiness and capability, and it might lead to open defiance if Trump pushes too far. The alternative is for Trump to back off, to respect the limits that military leaders are signaling, to stop treating the military as a political tool. But that would require Trump to admit he's been wrong, to accept constraints on his authority. And that's something Trump has never been willing to do. So we're probably going to see continued escalation, more firings, more resignations, more tension between the White House and the Pentagon, and eventually, possibly, a moment where military leaders openly refuse an order and create the crisis everyone has been trying to avoid. The silent protest at the Virginia summit is a warning. It's military leaders saying, we've reached our limit. Push us further and we're going to push back. We're going to resign. We're going to refuse orders. We're going to make this a public crisis rather than continuing to manage it quietly behind the scenes. Trump should have listened to that warning, should have recognized that he's alienated the very people he needs to implement his national security agenda. But Trump doesn't listen to warnings. He doesn't recognize limits. He doubles down when challenged. So this situation is probably going to get worse before it gets better. The relationship between Trump and military leadership is fundamentally broken, and in a democracy that depends on civilian control of the military, that's a crisis we can't afford to ignore. The rude awakening Trump got at that Virginia summit should have been a wake-up call, a moment to step back and reconsider his approach. But knowing Trump, it probably just made him angrier, more determined to assert his authority, more willing to push military leaders until something breaks, And when something does break, when we have mass resignations or open defiance or a genuine constitutional crisis over military orders, we'll look back at this summit as the moment when the warning signs were clear, when military leaders showed Trump they were done tolerating his approach and Trump chose to ignore them. That's where we are. That's what this silent protest means, and it's only going to escalate from here.